Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Farwell, and welcome to this webinar on key issues for charities, coronavirus and related matters. I'm head of the Charities and Education team, James Cooper Creston. I'm working at home, not surprisingly at the moment, in Hungerford. I'm hoping for no interruptions during the webinar. We've got a great turnout on the webinar. Obviously, people are at home, perhaps haven't got quite so many things to do as they normally do. So we've got a good mix of trustees management across a whole range of different charities. Hopefully you can all see the slides on your screen. The webinar is due to last approximately 30 minutes. You have the facility to ask questions on screen as we go, and we will deal with those at the end. Also at the end of the presentation you will see my contact details. I'm very happy if anyone wants to email me or ring me afterwards with any specific questions. So let's move on to the detail. In terms of introduction, coronavirus has clearly been a huge issue for a whole range of people in recent times. And I think it's fair to say that if I'd been doing this presentation on key issues in the charity sector 2 months ago, it would have been a completely different presentation to the one I'm now doing. So in terms of the private sector, certain areas there are very exposed. So anyone who's in hotels, retail, travel, entertaining or hospitality have had some very difficult conditions to deal with in recent times. The public sector, clearly there's a big implication there. We've seen naturally a huge impact in terms of the NHS. We've seen school closures, etc. But I think the public sector benefits to a degree because their income streams are a bit more certain. And then, of course, there is the third sector, the charity sector. And I think there has become an increasing awareness in recent days about some of the problems facing the sector as a result of coronavirus. So just as a few examples, we've seen Alzheimer's Age UK furlough around 2/3 of their staff. St John Ambulance, another large charity, said they won't be able to continue for a long period if there's no help. Cancer Research has said that they've had to scale back their research plans as fundraising has slowed down and shops are closed. The RNLI, which has huge levels of reserves. Last time I looked, I think it had 3 years of cost sitting in its reserves, also has plans to furlough some workers. And Macmillan are saying that they anticipate losing about half of their fundraising income this year, around £100 million. So it's clear that there's a huge impact on the sector, and naturally we will cover that as we go through the webinar. I think we are fair to say that risk management is an important topic for charities into the future. Many charities have had pandemic on their risk register for some time, but pretty much a low risk item. I think we'll be seeing that change potentially in the future. And we'll close the webinar by just discussing a few other issues for charities, because many of the other charity issues that were relevant 2 months ago will be equally relevant in the future, although naturally they may have been affected by coronavirus. So in terms of the topics we'll be discussing, we're going to canter through a whole range of topics. Many of you will know about these issues already and will have addressed them, so hopefully it will give you some comfort, but hopefully a few of you will get some ideas on how you might deal with these issues. So impact on income streams and funding opportunities, we'll cover that. We'll look at the importance of controlling costs in these difficult times. We'll look at reserves and cash flow management. We'll talk about some government support, and of course there were some announcements last night about some additional support for charities. I was delighted to hear about that, although it did take place 5 minutes after I'd finalised my slides, so some hastily revision there. The Charity Commission has produced some guidance. I have to say that I've been a bit underwhelmed by what they have produced, and I think the NCVO has produced much more useful information. Clearly there's an impact on beneficiaries. I think the questions of meetings, communication and good governance is clearly relevant in these times, a significant change where it's very difficult to hold face-to-face meetings. As you'll all know, significant impact for employees and operational issues. We've got quite a few schools on the line, so we'll have a discussion about some of the specific issues affecting schools. There's also been some pronouncements around accounting and reporting and how that may be impacted. And then finally, we'll close with other issues. So that's a broad outline of what we're intending to cover. So if we start by the impact on income streams, I think it's fair to say that charities have a huge variety of income streams, and it will be important to assess these all individually, and every charity will be different. As we said at the start, public sector income perhaps a bit more certain, though there may be some changes in the future because clearly there's very significant government expenditure in this period. So it is possible that there will be some cutbacks in terms of public sector support for the charity sector in the future. Fundraising events income has been devastated really because naturally it's impossible to hold an event at the moment and nobody knows how long that will continue into the future. And so it's very difficult to plan. Even if you're looking at holding an event in August, September time, you can't be absolutely sure. And of course, no event goes successfully without a significant amount of planning. I think we have seen and will see some imaginative fundraising around online things, perhaps a quiz on one of the teleconferencing platforms, for example. So expect to see lots of innovation in the next period of time. I think donations from trusts will be affected significantly. I think we've seen a significant reduction in investment values and many companies are not paying dividends at the moment, which will affect the income from those trusts. Anyone who's a corporate fundraiser at the moment has my sympathy because that's very much devastated as the companies look to sort of cut back and restrain themselves in terms of expenditure. So I think it's going to be a bit difficult for a while there. Charities which are property based have been hugely affected because naturally they won't be able to hold any activities. So, for example, theatres are perhaps the most obvious example there. And I think, for example, the National Trust has closed all its properties and it's also been hit by investment income. So huge impact there, but although naturally that charity has huge reserves. Event-based charities have been significantly affected. I'm a trustee of an arts charity, the Newbury Spring Festival, which was due to take place in May, and we've had to cancel that because of coronavirus. Charities have increasingly in recent years learned to develop commercial trading activities which have supplemented their charitable income. So they've taken a big hit. So for example, a charity might be involved in carrying out some training or other activities to generate income. Many of those activities are carried out in trading subsidiaries. Of course, they've been hit for that reason. Some charities, so cancer research, for example, operate significant numbers of shops. They're all closed at the moment. So, and again, another drop in income. Lettings income has been significantly affected. So, for example, schools which are letting out their facilities are no longer able to generate that income. I think we're seeing some charities who have significant levels of investment property as a source of generating income have been hit. Many of their tenants, for example, retail operations may be closed down. So people are asking for rent holidays and rent reductions. And investment income in terms of charities with significant stocks and shares hit in two ways. One is the drop in value, although I think stock market valuations have increased a bit in the last few days, but also a reduction in income due to the dividend point I mentioned earlier. In terms of what you can do about some of these things, naturally some of these matters are very difficult to control, but some charities, if they've got surplus properties, either properties that may be surplus to requirements or investment properties, looking to sell this to generate some cash. I think we're seeing the importance of communication with all stakeholders in charities, but particularly those who are influential in terms of generating funding. We have seen an increase in philanthropy, so rich individuals supporting charities in recent years, and there have been some announcements and pledges from regular supporters of charities that they will continue and increase their contribution in the present climate, and hopefully that will continue into the future. So very much speak with supporters and make sure that you're communicating so that people know the situation you're in, so that you can try to make sure that they're able to help you. We're seeing some charities who are really devastated and potentially facing closure are launching appeals, sort of survival type appeals, to try and generate some one-off income to continue in operation. Charities that are doing that, I always encourage them, if they're looking to raise funds from individuals, to make sure that they do that under gift aid to increase the value of donations. And I think we're seeing all charities looking at planning into the future to see how they can develop potentially new income streams or make sure that they maximise what they get from existing streams. So a huge impact on income streams for charities. Moving on to emergency funding opportunities, the Charities Aid Foundation has an emergency fund. Essentially, they're there to support charities with income up to £1 million, and their grants will be up to £10,000. The National Lottery Community Fund has indicated that it will honour its commitments for honour its existing commitments, but over the next 6 months we'll look at coronavirus-related charities only, or initiatives to deal with the present crisis. The Arts Council has announced £160 million of additional funding. 50 million of that is to organisations not regularly funded by the Arts Council already. Sport England have announced some additional funding, £195 million, including 55 million to help keep people active and to secure charity activities into the future. The National Lottery Heritage Fund has received £50 million. Again, that's looking at COVID-19 only. There's also an organisation, the National Emergencies Trust, which is the domestic equivalent of the Disasters Emergency Fund, which often is relevant for issues overseas. That is looking at carrying out and giving grants between £1,000 to £5,000, so very small charities. There's been much publicity about the business interruption loan scheme. I think we're seeing many of our corporate clients are having much difficulty accessing that loan scheme. And I think in terms of charities, it's only relevant if more than half of the charities' activities come from trading. One of the current issues is quite how you define what trading is. So there's some lobbying going on to see if that scheme can be extended to charities. If you're looking at that scheme, what I would say from early experiences in the commercial sector is the banks are struggling to effectively deal with the scheme. So at the moment, it's not working as well as people might expect. There may, of course, well be many other initiatives, and there are other organisations looking to do things. The Chancellor made an announcement last night about a £750 million support for charities. 360 million of that will go through to government departments who will allocate it to key services. Another £370 million is to be allocated to local charities, again, to do with coronavirus activities. So things like medical charities, financial advice, food deliveries, etc. And the BBC's Big Night In event, which is coming up shortly, the government has announced additional match funding up to with at least £20 million and possibly more. Right, so in terms of controlling costs, the job retention scheme has been hugely well publicised and has massively used. Some of you may have come from an earlier webinar we did today on this particular scheme, which had a huge audience. So those of you that are interested in that topic, there will be a recording of that available. So I'd encourage you to see that on our website. So essentially, this scheme provides 80% of salary costs up to £2,500 per individual. The calculations can be quite complex, and on our website there's examples of the potential calculations. But this essentially, this isn't a loan. This is money that you won't be expected to pay back to government unless they change the rules, and I don't see any likelihood of them doing that given the publicity. So many charities, a bit like we mentioned Age UK, for example, earlier, have furloughed many of their staff who are currently not working but receiving a salary. There is a debate about how much salary they might receive. I think we're seeing many organisations paying the 80% in line with the government support. So that is something that is really worth looking at. Changing ways of working. So many charities are looking at doing things differently. They're seeing that they have to do things differently for the time being, so they may reduce their services. Unfortunately, we are seeing some redundancies. I think in terms of assessing costs, it's really important to identify what your fixed costs and what your variable costs are. So fixed costs may be harder to control than the variable ones. We're seeing many charities looking to cancel contracts, so that may be property-related costs if your premises are closed, so for example, cleaning or catering. Many are looking at recruitment freezes or reducing staff hours. I think we're seeing expenditure projects being delayed and some postponement of capital expenditure. it's been interesting to see how people have adapted to the current climate by the use of technology. So I think those charities and indeed other organisations that have invested in remote working technology are certainly seeing the benefits at the moment, and others are perhaps struggling to keep up. If you do have any necessary capital expenditure, you may find that suppliers are prepared to offer some free credit for the time being. But whatever you would do about controlling costs, it's important to maintain internal control, particularly when there's less people in the office, people working remotely, etc. And sadly, I think the expectation is there will be more attempts at fraud in this period of disruption. So a lot of things to do in terms of controlling costs, but certainly important to try and make sure that internal controls are still in place and that fraud risk is minimised. So if we move on to reserves and cash flow management, reserves have been a huge issue for the charity sector for some time. I think charities range from those that have very minimal reserves, so struggle to know how they will pay their employees at the end of the month, to other very large charities which may have huge levels of reserves. Sadly, some of the charities with no reserves are going to really struggle to get through this period and really need to think nimbly to survive. But for those charities who do have reserves, I mean, I think often one of the reasons for holding reserves is to deal with unexpected events and rainy day funds. So I think some charities are seeing that, well, this rainy day has now finally arrived, and this is the time to be looking at spending reserves to support their activities. Charities which have designated funds may want to undesignate them to be able to spend money on coronavirus-related events, activities, etc. I think as far as restricted funds are concerned, so those funds which have been given for a very specific purpose, the rules still apply in terms of how those funds need to be used. But I think we are seeing that some charities are approaching donors to see if they can actually spend the money for a different purpose. And I think people are often being quite accommodating. So if you have significant levels of restricted funds, it may be worth looking at that. We've talked about some of the emergency funding already. Cash flow management is important, so not just short term, but medium and longer term as well. I think those of you that are owed money by people that you provide services to need to make sure that you chase your debts to make sure you get the money as quickly as possible, and manage receipts and payments as much as you can. So it may be that you delay some payments longer than you might otherwise do. I think we're seeing, there may be some contingency costs, some unexpected costs that arise to do with coronavirus. So that may be another suitable use of reserves. And I would encourage you, even if you're not looking at the business interruption loan scheme, I would encourage you to speak with your bank manager, make sure you've got some good dialogue there. So if you do need some support in the future, hopefully there's more likelihood of it being forthcoming. And as with so many issues around the present time, communication is really important to make sure you're communicating with everyone that has an influence over your reserves and cash flow management. So government support. So the various support measures are open to charities. I think it's been made quite clear, for example, the job retention scheme. It's worth mentioning that runs to the 31st of May so far. A couple of points to mention on that. One is that the portal for being able to actually get your hands on some of this government support, which may be really critical for some charities that are struggling. Hopefully that will be later this month. And the other thing I would say, if you're putting employees on furlough, is to make sure that you take appropriate legal advice so you don't end up with claims post-event, because particularly if you're looking at reducing salaries, it's important that you take that advice. There's been a well-publicised suspension of VAT payments for the current quarter through to the delay payment through to March 21. So if you're a charity that pays VAT, that may be useful. Those of you that are really struggling can negotiate with HMRC on a time to pay arrangement for your POI and tax bills. What I would say there is you have to ring HMRC. It can take a long time to get through, but once you get there, it's worth persevering with. There are some help in terms of statutory sick pay in this period. And in terms of rates, those of you that are involved perhaps with retail shops or leisure activities, for example, there will be some additional rates relief, although for many charities they already have a 80% subsidy on their rates in any case. And there's also some extension of accounts filing deadlines for 3 months, which we'll cover later. So in terms of Charity Commission guidance, I said this had been a bit disappointing, but they have recognised that they will take a flexible and pragmatic approach to regulation at this time, but they do encourage trustees to also consider wider and longer term issues. Some charities have been considering changing their objects. For example, they may have some funds that they would like to use for coronavirus related activities, but they need to be careful to make sure that they comply with their objects in doing that. Some charities have very wide objects which might cover any charitable purpose. It may be that you need to consider changing objects to do that, and the Charity Commission have indicated that they will prioritise COVID-19 related issues in terms of objects changes. We talked about government support, we've talked about use of reserves. They've also issued some guidance in terms of AGMs and meetings, so we'll cover that a bit later. Obviously that needs to be considered in the context of governing documents. The requirement to make reports to the Charity Commission under the serious incident reporting, for example, that still continues. So there may well be more reports in this particular period. So for example, if a charity was expecting to close down or if there were some individuals at risk, they've also indicated that, you know, the importance of keeping people safe in terms of, well, for example, vulnerable individuals and those who are self-isolating. And they've also issued some guidance on accounts and reporting. There's also some indication in terms of charities working with third parties that anyone working with businesses to deliver services in this period doesn't need to consider carefully who they're getting involved with, so make sure it doesn't damage the reputation of their charity or indeed harm beneficiaries. So that's the Charity Commission guidance, but the NCVO guidance I think is a bit more useful in terms of looking at their website if you're interested to see that. So of course in this period there's potential big impact on beneficiaries, so some charities will see an increased demand for services, so particularly charities with health related objectives. And I think we saw, for example, in the 2008 financial crisis, I mean that was not related to any health issues of course, but the financial hardship that caused did lead to increased demand for charity services. So clearly there's a big impact on the NHS, so any charity supporting the NHS will be affected, and of course the NHS capacity may be constrained, so there may be some requirement for other charities to provide more support. We need to consider vulnerable beneficiaries, so for example elderly people, people in prison. There's been an increase in domestic abuse. I think it will potentially be some racial discrimination and also an impact in terms of refugees. Naturally, homelessness charities will be severely affected, where social distancing may be a significant issue, and that the same is also true for care homes and hospices, where you have a combination of issues around social distancing and people who may have underlying health issues and therefore may be vulnerable. Many of those homes are of course closed to any external visitors. Mental health issues have been a big issue in recent times, and I think we're expecting to see an increase in support both during the current period and into the future. I think there's been a 25% increase in calls to domestic abuse helplines. Financial hardship will also create some issues that may be to do with young people or a whole range of other people. Perhaps we're expecting to see an increase in unemployment, so clearly some significant issues there which may create mental health issues. I think we have seen an upsurge in the use of volunteers, so this may be a good way of increasing resources in your charity to deal with some of this demand. So at local level, for example, people delivering food to people that are self-isolating. And in a time where face-to-face meetings are very difficult, digital engagement, telephone calls, helplines, etc., may be a really good way of helping beneficiaries. So a big impact on beneficiaries, and especially so for some particular charities. So in terms of meetings, communication and good governance, the Charity Commission does recognise this as an issue. So it may be that some charities will cancel or postpone AGMs. Whatever you decide to do, I think you need to record what you decide. And I think if you do make a sensible decision, it's unlikely that you would come in for major criticism into the future. And naturally, you may want to check should check your governing documents. It's possible you might be able to amend those to hold electronic meetings, etc. And many people are now holding video teleconferencing meetings for trustee meetings, for example, and they could, of course, also be used for AGMs. I've used a variety of these platforms in recent weeks. I think the one that seems to work most effectively is Zoom, where you can see everyone's face on the screen. There's a free offer and there's a paid for offer. I think the free offer allows you meetings of around up to 40 minutes. The paid for offer, I think, is only £12 a month or something, so that may well be worth considering. I've had several successful trustee meetings using this technology. Clearly, it's not as good as a face-to-face meeting, but it's really better than trying to do some sort of telephone conference without seeing people's faces. And there is the ability in terms of voting, which can create some issues, particularly if you've got a lot of people. I've seen some people have, there's a facility for a thumbs up thing on Zoom, which I think can help indicate in favour. And I think one or two charities I've seen have used a sort of a negative assurance. So basically the chair has put forward a proposal and then people are asked if, to shout or to talk if they disagree with that proposal. So that's one way of dealing with it. I think in terms of these meetings, it's quite good to get as many questions through beforehand so they can be addressed, and it's important to have a strong chair. So there are some tips for having an effective meeting. I think we're seeing the need for speedy decision making. I think positions have been changing so rapidly, which can create some issues in terms of trustees. Potentially having more meetings. I think I'm seeing more meetings involving trustees over the last few weeks. And of course, there are other pressures of trustees. They may be involved with businesses or have personal issues to do with coronavirus. So huge pressure on everyone to give adequate input into all the areas that they're involved with. Again, communication is important, stakeholders, employees, funders, beneficiaries, etc. And of course, take professional advice where appropriate. So some clues, some hints there in terms of what you might do around governance. In terms of employees and operational issues, clearly there may be some issues around the loss of key employees, hopefully temporary only, and it's a good idea perhaps to have some contingency plans in place if this does happen. Naturally, it's incumbent on all of us to prevent the spread of disease, and there may of course also be an increase in sickness over a period of time. This may involve closure of premises, for example, if there has been a coronavirus related issue at a particular premises. We've talked about mental health. I think there will be some issues around job insecurity for employees, particularly those who have been furloughed, and wondered why, particularly if it's a relatively small number of people that are furloughed, why they were selected for that. So I think we are seeing that mental health charities will be an increased demand for their services. I think we're all, or many of us, are getting used to remote working. Some sectors, of course, that's very difficult, but many employees will miss the day-to-day contact, and also it will be much harder to supervise employees. So again, keeping good communication. And whilst employees on furlough aren't allowed to actually do any work, you are allowed as an employer to keep in contact with them. So, I would encourage you to do that if you do have employees in that situation. We've mentioned Zoom, but of course there are alternatives to Zoom. So, for example, Microsoft Teams is one that people are using. I wouldn't say that's quite so successful for larger meetings because there's a limited number of faces that you see on screen. But again, I think we're seeing, things will need to be done differently now and in the future. So, for example, there is some expectation that we may see more employees working from home in the future, as we've demonstrated that can be done successfully over the last few weeks. So I mentioned at the start, we've had a number of schools on the line. So schools, I have to say, have adapted incredibly quickly to the new environment in which we operate. So there was some anticipation that there would be some school closures, and schools have adapted incredibly well to the logistics of remote learning, both independent and state schools and academies. Some schools have found it difficult with the technology, but most have done remarkably well. I think it's a bit harder for primary schools with younger children to do it, but certainly seems to have been successful for secondary schools. In terms of independent schools, some real pressures there in terms of fees. So I think we're seeing many independent schools reducing their fees for this summer term for around 10%, because of course pupils won't be at the school. And I think there may well be issues in terms of fees into the future. So I think many schools have decided not to increase fees for the autumn term, but have indicated they will review it in the future. This, of course, comes at a time when affordability of school fees is a significant issue, particularly with increases in teacher pension costs. And I think some schools are expecting some challenges in terms of numbers starting at independent schools in September time. Particular issues for schools with boarding fees, because of course pupils aren't at the school, very hard to charge the fees for the boarding. And I think there's some concern about those schools that rely heavily on international pupils in terms of whether they'll come back in the future. It's always been important for schools to do long-term forecasting around numbers, etc. So I would encourage schools to be doing that at least 3 years into the future. I think we're seeing the potential that there may be some bad debt, so perhaps people that have been able to afford school fees in the past may struggle to do so in the future if they've lost their job, for example, and you might well see more requests for support and payment plans. Independent schools have done some furloughing, so typically support staff. I think there's an expectation that in many independent schools there'll be no pay rises this year, and schools also looking at sort of cost control. Capital projects often are being delayed, and I think clearly with some of these schools they also have significant trading activities, for example summer vacation lets, and this is another impact that they're facing which has negative cash flow implications. Communication with parents, in particular pupils, employees, etc., is really important for schools, and I think many schools have done a good job of this. And it's been an interesting time in terms of the interaction between school governors and senior management teams in terms of decision making, and I think I've seen many schools where that's worked well. In terms of academies, the impact in terms of remote learning is just as great. Of course, the money for academies in terms of funding comes from the DfE, and the DfE have confirmed that core funding will be continuing. So the general annual grant they receive will continue regardless of closure, and there's expectation that special educational needs should continue as was. There is some, on Tuesday, some specific funding was announced for academies in terms of any one-off costs relating to coronavirus. So anything, for example, to do with extra cleaning, and if there's been a coronavirus outbreak at the school, other costs relating to premises, and there was also something around free school meals. But so I think academies, in terms of their main funding streams, are reasonably secure, albeit that they may see some reduction in some income, such as lettings, for example. In terms of accounting and reporting, the Charities SOB, the Statement of Recommended Practice, has issued some guidance. So it may well be that some adjustments to accounts are required as a result of coronavirus. So there may be some bad debt write-offs, for example. There's a requirement to consider in the trustees report disclosures relating to coronavirus in terms of the risk and the impact and the uncertainties perhaps around the future. So in terms of the going concern accounting policy, this is the assessment of whether the charity can continue in operation from 12 months from finalising the account. So this is something that charities and their auditors will need to consider. We'll see this year, I think, valuation of investments, a significant drop, and that's something that should be referred to in the trustees report as well as being reflected in the accounts. And I think we're like those charities that have final salary scheme pension arrangements may well see some more significant deficits on the balance sheet as a result of the reduction in asset values and potentially an increase in pension liabilities. It may well be that there are some impairments to do with assets, so this is perhaps where a fixed asset is unlikely to generate much income in the future. So potential impact on the audit report, issues around trading subsidiaries, which of course don't generally have huge levels of reserves and will have likely have received a significant reduction in income. So there may be some issues around accounting and disclosure in those companies. And I think we've seen extension of filing deadlines. So any charitable companies that are affected by coronavirus can apply for a 3-month extension. So rather than having 9 months to file their accounts after the year end, that can be extended to 12 months. It's very straightforward to do this. And the Charity Commission, perhaps for those charities that aren't companies, have also indicated flexibility around year-end dates. So that's a question of emailing the Charities Commission, and generally we found that they have approved it. So that's the position in terms of year ends. And I think we're also seeing some charities delaying finalising audit reports. So charities who don't want an uncertainty paragraph in their audit report may decide to delay finalising their accounts for longer than usual, so they don't have that. So that's it in terms of coronavirus related activities. In terms of other issues, so at the start I mentioned charities facing lots of other issues. Some of these naturally will be influenced by coronavirus, but I've just picked out a few here which I think are relevant. The first is strategy. So it may well be that charities need to review their strategies as a result of coronavirus. This may be to do with income, it may be to do with how they operate, it could be to do with the services they provide. So a good time and charities to review strategy, and charities should be doing this on a regular basis anyway. Naturally, a long-term viability and financial resilience for many charities is under threat at the moment. It was an issue prior to coronavirus, so it's certainly thrown into sharper focus now. Safeguarding, of course, will remain a significant issue. Trustee skills is an interesting one. That's certainly been a big theme of the Charity Commission in recent times, and it will be interesting to see how you feel once all this is over, how the trustee board has stood up to the challenges that have been thrown at them, and how the interaction has gone with the management team. So there may be some issues to look at there. Risk management we mentioned at the start, so I think that's something that we will see charities having another look at in the future. I think we'll see pandemics increasing in terms of their significance on risk registers. Let's hope this never happens again, but of course it has happened. I think people will be more aware of the possibility of it happening in the future, and clearly it's had a massive impact on everyone. Cyber security remains a big issue. Unfortunately, we're seeing more scams in this current time, so watch out for anything there. We'll see, I think, much more innovation in terms of new income generation, particularly if other income streams are drying up. But I mean, that remains an issue regardless of the current issues. Mergers and collaboration is an important one. I think we've seen how we are all as individuals and organisations all closely linked together. So this is a great time to be speaking with other people, working together with other people, whether they're charities or public sector organisations or companies, etc., essentially to make sure that you have maximised your positive impact on your beneficiaries. Flexibility is a key thing. It's been amazing how well I think people have adapted to the new reality over recent weeks, and I think it's demonstrated the importance of charities being nimble and being able to respond quickly to change. And then, of course, I think one of the biggest issues that we're facing is climate change, and I think that will continue into the future. It's been interesting to see with the reduced transport over the last few weeks how that's had a really positive impact on the environment, and it may be that people will now, just as an example in terms of travel, we will see perhaps more and more meetings being carried out by teleconferencing facilities, and we may see people working more from home, so this will have an impact potentially on reducing travel. So I've gone past my 30 minutes by a few minutes, but hopefully that's given you some thoughts. So the final slide there is the question of my contact details. I'm happy for anyone to contact me if they've got any follow-up questions, either by email or telephone. I think there's a few questions arriving on screen. Does furlough apply to apprentices? I believe it applies to all employees. I think unfortunately we have seen quite a lot of apprentices who have been made redundant over the last few weeks, but hopefully that won't continue, and those employees that apprentices that are on furlough will get back to a full-time working environment in the future. So that was the first question. I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions. So I think somebody's comment around the job retention scheme in the portal, I haven't seen the full details of that. Somebody's asked around holding an AGM by virtual conference. I think that's a sensible idea, as long as you document clearly why you're doing that. And realistically, at the present time, you haven't really got any alternatives in terms of how you hold an AGM other than a deferment. So I think that would be the way I would deal with AGMs. Partly depends on how many people you have coming along to your AGM. If you're an AGM with 20 people, it's fine. A bit harder if you've got 100 or 200 people. But we have seen some charities just taking the decision that even though they have a requirement for such a meeting, that they've got no alternative but to cancel. And I think that's all the questions I can see on screen. So if you have any further thoughts, then do follow up with me. I'm very happy to deal with any questions that anybody has. Thank you very much for joining us, and best wishes for all your plans to deal with coronavirus, and hopefully things will be back to normal in the not too distant future. Thanks very much.